Hello! Welcome to Philosophy, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega and wsdtime.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping he would do that. Yeah, so I want to just tell people now, you're used to us doing what we call free will science and religion, but we're kind of starting a new show, Philosophy, Science, and Religion, that is a little bit more general. Because, George, we were talking about this, and we wanted to get more into philosophy, more in a more broad discussion than just the free will debate, because that's what we were talking about, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I think we have to recognize that with free will, we've been working on it for years, and the reality is that it's going to take some people quite a while to get it, to accept it, and so we don't want to wait around. We don't want to
Yeah.
spin our
No,
wheels.
I'm still trying to
There's a lot
figure it
more
out.
that all of us are interested in. We're all interested in a lot of other topics, so I figured this would be, a way to just present them within a single podcast.
Yes, I think so. And what our topic that we had discussed for this is we were going to talk more about, this notion of randomness that people have and evolution and our thoughts about that because we have some differing opinions from what you'll hear in mainstream because we've thought about this for some time. Like the whole random mutation thing that people talk about in evolution, that really confuses people. And we've talked about this before, George, but would you like to state what you think of this first, or should I?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me state it, and let me state it relative to something we already accept and understand. For example, DNA provides the encoding for the subsequent development of organisms. Like in the DNA are all the instructions for the development and growth and all that stuff of all our organs. I mean, like it's an amazing. It's kind of like a central processing center, right?
Kind of like a computer.
Yeah, that that the outcome. DNA knows what it wants, the body to do before the body, conforms to what the DNA is encoded for. So similarly, not exactly the same, but similarly, my belief, my understanding, I think it's got to be more of an understanding than a belief, is that, you know, this, even though like evolutionary change, mutations, random mutations, natural selection, etc., take place during vast spans of time, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps a million years in some cases,
Yeah.
that they are governed by a central, hold on, WSD, they are
Sorry.
governed by a central intelligence, kind of like a guiding intelligence that kind of knows in a way what it wants to happen, and in a kind of like an experimental manner, hit and miss sometimes, the way we conduct laboratory experiments, today in science, it kind of goes about it, but it's still an organized, purposeful and intelligent, because that's a lot of people don't like to hear that word. It's an intelligent, controlled process. That's my understanding.
Yeah, and here's how I kind of look at it. I tend to look at evolution, the evolution of DNA and biology. I consider that kind of like the evolution of language or the evolution of religion and politics, because I look at these tiny little parts, the tiny cells or the parts of DNA. I look at them as kind of like little people kind of arranging themselves into clubs and groups and tribes just as humans do. So I'm making like a comparison to the way humans do things. They do them intentionally. They intentionally do these things, and yet the way things evolve still is subject to natural selection because certain things work and certain things don't. Some things are better for survival than others. Just like, as you know, certain movies, for example, when a movie company produces a movie, certain movies sell better than others. And so they end up finding ways to make better and better movies based on what sells. And so I think of evolution as a trial and error process, one that, I, you know, natural selection is key because that determines what survives and what doesn't, but that doesn't prohibit there being an intention behind it necessarily.
Okay, what's your take there, Listy?
Well, evolution. Well, for me, like I said, I may not be as educated. All I know is it's a matter of a complex being become more complex and adapting to its a new environment. Its environment. Excuse me. That's
All right,
pretty
but
much all I see about it. It just
right, all right. So
I'm still
Chandler, to
trying to
address
yeah.
your analogy, you're saying, it has intent, but like in order to have intent, doesn't that require what we would, in a sense define as intelligence, that it's the intent of this intelligence, and we can even call it a consciousness, like, because how else, how else would we attribute intent except but to a being, and this, when I say that, I guess I'm referring to the entire universe, or this kind of like, invisible consciousness that's controlling everything. How else can we describe intent except in relation to something like that?
Well, I would agree that you need a being in order to have this intent, and yet here's where I think people really slip up and get confused. You've got you've got your hardcore scientists and atheists who are, on one hand, they want to get rid of the idea of having an entity with intent or intelligence because they can't include God in their worldview. But on the other hand, you've got some creationists, and intelligent design advocates who, what they try to do is they try to use these things where it appears in nature that things had to have evolved through intent, and then they try to use it to pitch their particular sect of their religion, and you can't, and their arguments never work. You know what I'm saying? Because you can't make the case for a specific religion just based on intelligence and nature.
Right, and Chandler, so yeah, we don't need to get into that because I don't think anybody here is saying that. If people are going to like misconstrue or misrepresent what we might present as scientific or philosophical in ways that are neither scientific or philosophical, we can't prevent that, but we can't allow their misrepresentation of that to kind of like divert us from using the evidence to arrive at our understanding.
Yes, I agree, George. I'm just stating that for the purpose of our audience because some people may misconstrue that, and I don't want them to misunderstand. We're not advocating for the Christian God of the Bible or anything like that necessarily, but we are saying that there is room for the idea of intention or intelligence in how things evolve, possibly.
I think what we're saying is stronger. I think that like not only is there room, I think that's the only reasonable explanation. Again, like you take one of so many different kinds of evolutionary changes that don't become operable, for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. I mean, how could a specific intent or purpose not explain that? And then how could like anything but a conscious intelligence explain that intent?
Yeah, so you're saying, for example, an adaptation, some mutation that doesn't immediately provide a survival advantage for that generation and takes many other mutations before it even begins to have an impact with natural selection, in a sense.
Like wings, okay? Like I imagine before organisms had wings, if I imagine for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, there were these like growths, these appendages that sprang up on the backs of certain, animals that, just had absolutely no use at all. They could have been perhaps even somewhat disadvantageous. But can you see that reasoning? Like, like, in other words, like, unless there was a guiding, a prior, guiding intelligence, guiding this evolutionary process, kind of like understanding or at least guessing that ultimately wings would be a beneficial or desirable kind of a trait or body part for an organism to have, how can you see the like, how could quote unquote a random process just organize itself, hundreds of thousands of years, like, in the making to create wings without it having, a prior intent or plan to do that?
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying there. And I think it goes even deeper because it doesn't even have to be wings. Let's just even talk about legs. Even the idea of going from single-celled organisms to something complex that has legs. And just look at all the varieties of legs that there are. We've got humans which have 2 legs they walk on, and then a bunch of others. A bunch of others have 4, and then you've got insects with 6 or even many more legs than that. You've got
sometimes
weird stuff.
1,000.
Yeah, you've got centipedes, millipedes, and fun stuff like that.
Even though there's a need for those bugs, those things freak me out.
Yeah, but come on, let's admit legs are useful because legs help you get around. So, like, think about it. There had to at some stage be this way in which this, like, I tend to think, well, the cells, the life forms were thinking, well, what if I had these little things I could stick out and propel myself, in different directions? Kind of like for example, with having a paddle for a boat. People paddle boats with these paddles or whatever. And they row. I mean, I think that's kind of the same way that it may have started out. Because look, my memory is terrible, and I haven't learned all that much. But I have looked at microorganisms. I've looked at these tiny microorganisms, paramecia and all these weird things that you can't see without a microscope. But then people blow up these videos of these tiny creatures where they're super huge, and you see they're swimming through the water, and it's like brilliant.
And Chandler, that's another example. My understanding is that land organisms evolved from sea organisms. So you imagine some fish, you kind of like, they pop their head out of the water, they have eyes, they see there's this stuff out there, but they realize that, for example, let's say they attempt to go on land, whatever, right? On a beach. And I guess they realize, oh my God, we got to get back into the water because they can't breathe the air, right? So yeah, there seemed to have been an intent. And again, like, we understand from our no free will perspective that if a fish is thinking to itself, gee, it'd be nice to be out, in this like new environment that's not all wet, that it's not the fish's thought that there's an intelligence or consciousness that is endowing that fish with that thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let's consider the frog. The tadpoles, they start out with gills and they're fish-like, and then they turn into these frogs. They lose their gills and then have lungs, and then they become like these land-dwelling creatures, even though they still are good swimmers.
Yeah.
And we don't. I mean, like human beings, Chandler. We have gills as fetuses.
Wait, we have gills?
Oh yeah.
I think cool. I read that.
I didn't think we had gills.
Well, I did remember reading that. I believe I read that in Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True. I never finished that book. I got so bored at some point.
Oh, I believe in evolution. It's just I never think we had gills.
Yeah, not as fetuses, as maybe zygotes, very, very early in the process. You can, look it up, Google it, and they have photographs.
Oh, yeah, that part.
This is in theory. They have photographs of the actual gills. Absolutely, we human beings have them. The gills turned into, I think, if I'm not mistaken, into our hearing apparatus.
Whoa. Yeah, but it's interesting because I understand that when we're developing them, when we go through
Didn't
these
expect that.
stages, we go through these stages where we actually resemble other animals more. We resemble fish and stuff like that, which is cool, really, when you think about it. It's like a small remainder of our past when our ancestors were that type of thing.
Right. All right. So, like the argument that we are contesting, and some of us in our group, in our free will group, hold this. That we've, Chandler, you mentioned we've had this discussion before, and I think it's important to keep having it to get a clearer and stronger understanding. The view that we're contesting is that evolution just quote unquote happens randomly. It just happens. Now, I'm sorry, they do not just happen. To me, the it's incoherent. It's illogical to,
Well,
to hold on to conclude that something happens without there being a plan or an intent or some kind of like an intent.
Well,
But
I would agree and disagree because now everything has a cause, so there's no randomness. But then again, there are mistakes that happen. Where we're just like humans end up doing things that they never intended to do, like
or
slipping on a
supposed to
banana.
do like the 100 megaton bombs. But that's another topic.
Yeah, well, like I was just going to use the example, like somebody slips on a banana peel, but they didn't intend to do it.
Oh yeah.
But so
well,
not every,
Chandler, go ahead.
right. I was just going to say, so not everything actually is intended, but I think a lot more is intended than people think about.
Well, Chandler, I think
Yeah.
beneath good way to understand, because you're making a good point, but a way to understand that relative to human experience is like imagine the process I think Edison went through when trying to find the right filament for his light bulb. I mean, my understanding, if I remember correctly, is he went through many different kinds of like materials, different fibers to see what material would stay ignited and not decompose quickly, to be able to like light up and stay lit and not be too hot or all that stuff. So like there was purpose and intent to his experimentation, and he made a lot of mistakes in science. This isn't just Edison, like science in general, pharmaceuticals, just medicine and stuff. They go through hundreds, thousands sometimes of mistaken trials before they hit on the answer to what they want. But the point that I'm raising here is that yes, while it's not a kind of an omniscient, all-knowing process, it is fraught with a lot of mistakes. There is an underlying intent behind this experimental process.
Yeah, I mean, there's trial and error. Whenever you're doing something, there's always a process of trying something, it doesn't work, and so you try something else. And I just tend to think evolution is a little bit more like that, And at a certain point, it's like life forms discovered that certain things just seem to work. The legs worked and the wings worked, but I think it was it's sort of like, here's another way of looking at it. Humans build upon previous generations' work, and we usually pass on this information through books or recordings where people build on the knowledge of past generations. But what I would say is that DNA, the code of DNA, is sort of like the book that is passed on to future generations, because that's what is passed on. Because other organisms didn't have audio and video recordings and the printing press, so they used DNA to pass on the messages of their findings to future generations.
Right. So like DNA is like the organic physical structure mechanism for guiding the development of an organism's physical structure, and all fine. But then like we have to understand that there was an intent and a purpose behind making DNA, giving DNA those properties. And like so, Chandler, you mentioned natural selection, and that's we have to address that directly. In other words, like the defense of randomness, this insane randomness that basically things just happen, it relies on, it says, well, evolution basically happens because of natural selection, the kinds of changes that are desirable to the species survival and prosperity. Those are the changes that we see, that work and that become operational. But what they don't realize is that there has to be a process guiding the experimental process of these mutations. In other words, these mutations are not completely random. In other words, like a mutate, like for example, they're in developing, let's say this wings again. There must have been like thousands, if not millions, of kinds of changes that didn't result in
I heard that they
functioning wings.
actually I heard I thought they glided before they started flying. They had to glide before they started flying.
All right, well,
that's
yeah. Right, but before
glide,
that,
yeah.
think about that. Think of before even that. Like these have little stubs, these nubs on the back of these organisms have no function at all. And like so, even in the development of them, how can you can't natural selection's not going to explain that, because like both the successes which represent these knobs that may take a million or long. I got to like research into this timeline of how, for example, between the first steps that we can determine in the evolution of wings and a functional wing, even if it's a glider, like WSD just said, how many years, how many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years did it take to get to that point? But again, the basic point is like, in the early development of this, natural selection does not explain these two growing bumps or whatever, on the backs of these animals that have no purpose and won't have a purpose for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing. And see, here's the deal: is like I don't really understand all the details of it, and see, here's what's difficult about it is that the average person doesn't have a firm grasp at evolution and how the explanations for these things. And so, unfortunately, the public has a tendency to take that as it not being valid just because there's only the people who have dedicated their life to it have the full grasp of DNA and actually understand the whole process. So we're talking about it as from our perspective and how it appears to us. But yeah, I get what you're saying, absolutely, George, how it seems some of these mutations would have absolutely no use. They would have no benefit until much, much later after more mutations. And so it does seem impossible that it would get to something beneficial, and yet it does. So we're dealing with some, you're saying something that's guiding it towards a long-term goal that it's achieving.
Yeah, for example, all right, I just called up a link. I keyworded evolution of wings, right? And say, Chandler, we're not addressing the general public with this because, like, here in the United States, the general public, half of people believe in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve and stuff, but what we are actually addressing a real lack of intellect and logical reasoning in scientists. For example, this if you keyword Google evolution of wings, the first result, it's a title of an article in New Scientist, and it's titled "Evolution Myths: half a wing is no use." So they're trying to, like, I haven't read the article. Basically, they're promoting the idea that when there was just half a wing, that a lot of people saying that didn't have a use. They're saying, well, no, it had some kind of use. I don't know, maybe, right? But like, if you go to, let's say, 1/10 of a wing or 1/100th of a wing, ultimately you're going to get to a point where a change that took, let's say, hundreds of thousands, I'm guessing, if not millions of years to take place, to evolve, actually had absolutely no use at all. So my point, Chandler, is that we are like, this podcast, as with our Free Will podcast to a great extent, isn't really directed so much as the general public, but at the scientists who are not conducting science and coming up. It's kind of like, just as religion has certain, beliefs that are founded on nothing but, tradition and, one's parents and their parents said,
ancient texts.
Yeah, exactly. Just as religion's founded, there's a lot of science that are pseudoscience that relies on nothing more than that. That like some guy, a couple hundred years ago said something, and so like, the scientists today, without really thinking about it well enough, just go along with it.
Oh yeah, and I wouldn't want to be trying to educate the general public in the United States on evolution, because that's just torture. Who would do that to themselves?
Well, you pay me a couple $100,000 a year, then maybe.
Well, good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to educate the public on, and that it's something that's very easy to do. I think it would be happiness. Just like, help everybody become really happy. That'd be very cool. We should do an episode on that sometime.
Happiness? Huh.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because think about it. That's all we want. Anything else we might want, the only reason we want it is because like we predict or expect that it's going to maintain our happiness or make us happier.
Hey, that brings up another topic, George. How could this thing we're saying about evolution and the intent behind it, could this make us happier somehow?
Well, that's generally the intent. In other words, I'm guessing the intent of all evolution, and I have to say that with some reservation, because I was thinking about that actually earlier today, maybe most, is to benefit the happiness of the organism. But I think evolution is actually also concerned with the procreation and development of species. Hence, for example, females, as we were kind of like, as we went from like being on 4 feet or something, whatever, to up rising on 2 legs and stuff, right? Apparently our hips narrowed, and so that change, makes it much more painful for women to give birth, but it was nonetheless instituted for the survival of the species and not necessarily for the pleasure, the enhanced pleasure of individuals within the species. But so Chandler, I get that's a great question. That's a great consideration. I think the question becomes, what percentage perhaps of changes are designed to further the happiness of the individual versus the greatest success of the species?
Yeah, and another thing to make clear is that with biological evolution, the mutations that benefit the procreation, if the organisms survive long enough to procreate, then those genes that they have are more likely to be passed on. And yet the happiness is something to consider, because we want to just not be considering what helps the survival of the species. We need to be thinking, is the species actually happy? Does the species want to live? Because if we're always depressed and everything is only suffering, then there's absolutely no point in procreation.
Yeah, pretty much. Exactly why
That's good.
I'm not having no kids.
Yeah, and Chandler, we got to do something. We got to do an episode on antinatalism and all that thing. Because that's an excellent philosophical topic.
Yes. It definitely is. And we touched on that a little bit, because on that thing you and Monique and I were doing recently, which was a very good talk, by the way. I love that talk. Because I feel that there's this misunderstanding. There are a lot of people who tend to share the antinatalist view, or the view that we should not be having kids as to not impose the suffering of this human life on them and all the problems that go on. But it's not about hating kids. It's about not wanting them to have a miserable life. So happiness really is the focus at the heart of that message.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, but we might as well get into it because I think we've dealt with the randomness enough, and like as we do with all our episodes, I guess we give ourselves the freedom and leeway to just like move to whatever pleases us.
Yeah, so, whatever we feel like.
Yeah. So all right. So like considering that, here's the challenge with that, Chandler, is like, we're like we kind of there's a lot of evidence that if a child is born, they're going to experience actually a lot more pleasure, generally speaking, than pain, that people enjoy their lives. That's why, like, if, for example, if everybody was completely miserable, then I could see, like, people not, very few people wanting to, like, have kids to make them miserable and to make more miserable kids. So, in our physical existence, we have that evidence. But, even though I personally believe, for no evidence at all, but just to makes me feel good, that when we die, we all kind of like go to a better place and we're there eternally. I mean, that's, very blissful belief. There's no evidence for that. So in other words, it's kind of like the choice is either to procreate a child that has a chance of pleasure, or to deny, that to deny that prospect at all.
Yeah, well,
especially.
Yeah. Well, me, it doesn't look that good. Where you got that person in the White House and
he who must not be named.
Yeah, and his stupid administration. It's not looking good, and feel like better not procreate.
Oh yeah. See, here's the thing about it. Now, I think now there tends to be in antinatalist circles, there tends to be a focus on the negativity, and for good reason. But what I'm going to say is, George, some humans have a lot more pleasure than pain. Other humans have a lot more pain than pleasure. And you're rolling the dice when you procreate, which is, I think, it's like gambling. It's a dangerous thing to do. You know what? If you get what I'm saying, but
and my luck is not that good. So,
yeah, it's not good because of the potential harm. It's like it's sort of like like if you're told, well, you can flip a coin. If heads, your child will experience a life full of bliss and they'll be happy and all that. But then if it's tails, they're going to be born into a family that sexually abuses them from a very young age, and then when at the age of 12 they're going to be killed in a ritual satanic sacrifice or something. You know what I'm saying? You could and you got the choice of whether to procreate or not, but you don't know whether your child's going to have the bliss or is just going to experience horrible suffering and then die at a young age.
Ooh, that's simple. Don't have them.
Yeah, it's like it's not worth the risk.
All right, but Chandler, here's another way to do that. In other words, you're saying it's a kind of like a 50-50 proposition that, like, the child could, like, be born into a good family or not, in a sense. But it's actually more, because I've done a lot of research on happiness, where they've asked people, for decades, are you happy? How happy are you? And all that stuff. And the vast majority of people are happy, even fortunately, even in some very poor countries. I mean, our world has a lot of problems. Like, there's over 1 billion people who don't have clean drinking water, and sometimes enough food, like, and medicine Michigan? And all. Well, yeah, I mean, even here sometimes, yeah. But generally speaking, like if a person in most of the world now, fortunately, is considering the prospect of having kids, they can be relatively assured that kid is going to be relatively happy. Now, like the average happiness level of Americans is about 7 out of 10, 70%, which to my understanding isn't all that happy, but most people are pleased with it. Most people are satisfied with that level. So it really isn't kind of like a hit or miss type thing. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you have a kid, that the chances of the kid ultimately enjoying life much more than not are pretty high.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about it is like, to me, I think it's still a risk that if it turns out badly, you're going to regret it, and you will have if it does turn out badly, then you're going to say, oh no, I shouldn't have procreated, now I regret it. And then if it turns out good, then you're like, oh well, I did the right thing. But people end up having emotions based on the outcome, which they don't know. And I feel that there's some things you can try. Like you can try a food that you've never tried before. You'll either like it or dislike it, but what's the big deal? You know what I mean? But when you're creating a whole other person and you don't know what's going to happen in your life, I just feel like that's just something that you're gambling with somebody else by creating life, and they can't consent to it. But there is another thing. There is one other thing that really solidifies my thing about not procreating. And I really think that is that even if all the humans on the planet experience perfect bliss, the suffering they impose on the non-human animals means it's all worthless. It doesn't matter how happy the humans are if they are causing all that suffering to the non-human animals. And so that is
Chandler. And
yeah,
well, I understand your reasoning, but grant that consideration some perspective. The human species has been around for about 130,000 years, and this maltreatment of animals is, the way it is today, it's maybe a couple of hundred years old. And I guess domestication of animals is maybe 5,000 years old. So consider the vast history of humankind, of the human species, really didn't involve this mistreatment of other animals. So this is kind of like just, and the hope, of course, is that, that this is just like an outlier, that, where humanity has strayed. It's kind of like with the Trump thing. And Trump is only going to be in office for 4 or 8 years at the worst, and then he's gone. And with us as a species, yeah, right now we are so cruel. But the hope is, and the expectation relative to the 130,000 years that we've been around, is that we will evolve to a kinder, more compassionate species that goes back to not inflicting that cruelty.
right. And of course, that's the direction that we want to move toward. We want to move toward a world where humans are compassionate to not only the other humans but all the other animals. I would love to see a world where everyone's vegan, but still, we're just dealing with what we have. We see that humans cause suffering. We all want to move away from that because we all want to make a better world. That's the whole point of discussing the philosophy, the science, and the religion, is for us to come to an agreement on how we can make the world better. And by that, I mean increase our happiness. But I think that as Poffo often says, while we get our act together, people need to stop procreating, because humans can't even agree on things. We've got so many problems that even if they don't forever stop procreating, which I would be fine with if the human race did go extinct. I don't see a problem with that. But why not at least temporarily stop procreating while we're getting everything resolved, if we can't even fix these problems?
Well, Chandler, I think from an evolutionary standpoint, to get back to our first theme, we are designed to procreate, not just biologically designed, but also psychologically. In other words, for most of humanity, life isn't about just pursuing, science and knowledge and progress and stuff. For the vast majority of humanity, especially women, their purpose, their fundamental purpose is to have children and raise children. And, that's what the vast majority of adults do. So, to the, that what I'm saying is like that people would not, the way people are designed, they wouldn't give that up unless there was a very, very, very strong reason, and then actually in other words, like, for example, in China, there was that one child only policy, and we're trying to, reduce, populations because overpopulation is just harming us all. But I think rather than advocating for no kids at all, I think a more reasonable goal would be to maybe to stop the continued increase in population that is threatening to make life less pleasant for the species.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. See, I have a really hard time with this, George. What I have a hard time with is saying that, like, the purpose of women is to procreate. Like, I don't know. I could see how some women would be particularly offended by such a statement, and I'm sure you didn't mean it in a bad way. But
it's not just women; it's men. We're evolutionarily designed to want to procreate. That's the sex instinct is for that.
Right, and see, here's the thing: is that is an instinct that is evolved and has gotten strengthened more and more over time. And I'll admit it's powerful, but that's the problem. That's the enemy. That's what makes it so bad. Is almost everyone does have the desire to procreate, and that is a problem because what does that lead to?
Even the ones that shouldn't procreate.
Exactly. So even though you end up having anybody and everybody procreating, which is a very bad scenario because then there become problems with that. The more the population increases, then there does seem to be problems because then there's not enough jobs for people. And since we're still under a monetary system and since we haven't gone to a resource-based economy, war is the inevitable result of having so many people. And then people have various methods of population control, like abortion, which I think is terrible. And they don't look. A lot of people won't admit that that's what's going on. Is that it's a population control tactic. They try to frame it as a woman's right or bodily autonomy. But I really think there's a lot more going on politically behind the scenes about the abortion debate. But let's consider other alternatives, like banning in vitro fertilization. Think about that. That would be an interesting thing because that only applies to people who cannot conceive normally, and then they do these strange things. They'll either artificially implant, the sperm into an egg and then put it in a woman, or people will hire surrogates, other people to have children for them. And that would be an alternative method, is getting rid of people doing stupid things like that.
Chandler, wait a minute. Imagine like you got married to a woman and, you're raising a family. Let's say you're raised in a really fortunate family, had a great time as a childhood and stuff. And you want to experience that again through your children. But, for whatever reason, your wife can't have children in the regular way. Why are you painting this alternate, for what many couples is a blessing? I don't understand the reasoning behind painting it as so terrible.
Well, okay.
No, it wouldn't be painted so terribly if you paint it that way. It's terrible because I've been seeing stories like, these single parents having kids and they're overpopulating. Sometimes there's a story. This one woman had 15 kids. Are you kidding me?
Well,
that's what I'm talking about. We're not talking about the
but devil is there.
If you have family and all that, okay, I can let that. You can raise a kid up right, to be a mouse, is it? Okay, I'll let it go. It's just the people that shouldn't have kids. That's the problem. That's the they're coming to a problem with it.
Well, I think there's another thing to consider here. Basically, procreation isn't really done for the sake of the children. It's done because it pleases the parents and makes them happy sometimes to have kids. Or just because they have sex and they were using birth control, but the woman still got pregnant. So a lot of it is the kids are either not intended or they're intended because the parents have this desire to procreate, but the child can't agree to being brought into existence, and Trick Slattery would point that out too if he was here.
All right, but it's really about consent.
I do think that's important.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's two possibilities. One, that you consider that that it's wrong to bring a child into the world without its consent. But if you do that, the child is denied, or the potential child is denied the experience of life. And so the alternative is so then you also have to consider within this equation, the child is without, or the potential child without the potential child's consent is also, being relegated to not living. And so then the question becomes, well, is not living a better state than having a life?
Yeah, and I guess that's what it comes down to, isn't it? The key difference is the people who say that some say living is better than not living, and others say not living is better than living. What I would say, because I feel like this would be a little bit more uncontroversial to say, is that we don't know whether or not their life will be worth living to them. We don't know that. And I guess I just don't like the gambling aspect of it.
But Chandler, don't you see how you're gambling either way? In other words, by deciding not to have them, you are without their consent relegating them to non-existence.
Right, but they won't Yeah, well, here's the deal, though. It's not exactly an equal scenario, because here's the deal. If they don't exist, they're not going to complain. They're not going to know. You see what I'm saying? So no non-existent child is ever sad that it didn't have the chance to live.
Well, again, because it's a complete unknown. We don't actually know that. Who knows? I mean, my perspective is that if this life is all there is, I mean, these 80, 100 years, 60, whatever it's going to be, and then you've got at least 14 billion known years in the past, and who knows what came before that. There's presumably an eternity in the future. And so basically, if this single life is all we've got, then I'm saying to myself, what's the point? What's the point of anything? Where it's on part of it's kind of like it's kind of reasonable or maybe wise to kind of to cultivate the perspective. It's got to be a belief that this can't be everything, because it's such a blip within existence that So in other words, so you have a kid, big deal. You don't have a kid, big deal, because it's a nanosecond relative to the span of time and space. It's
Well, yeah, I get what you're saying, and yet I don't want to impose suffering on anyone. I don't want to run the risk of causing suffering to anyone, whether it's a human or some other animal that's large, or even an insect. I hate that idea, even for a short time. Even if it's only for a short time, I don't ever want to impose that suffering on anyone. And I think that is a lot of what is behind my thing about not procreating. I just don't think it's worth the risk.
All right, well, I'm gonna ask a question, and I'm not sure I've got the logic straight behind this, but let me try anyhow. So let's say, it's in your hands to either, have somebody live until tomorrow, or not. That you can like decide whether they live or die. Now that if you allow them to live, as with the fetus and kids and stuff, they're going to experience some pain, but hopefully also some pleasure. And then you don't know what happens to them, if you kill them and they die. So in other words, like by the argument you're using toward, in defense of not having kids, it seems that like you would be kinder to a person to kill them so that they might have an opportunity of a painless existence once they're no longer here.
Wow. Yeah. I do see what you're saying there, and I have heard similar things before. A lot of people do believe that killing is a merciful, kind thing to do. And I will admit that
as long as it's a mercy killing.
I do.
Euthanasia.
Yeah, see, the euthanasia thing, that is an interesting thing because while I personally feel very uncomfortable about euthanasia, I find it's also something that's really hard to argue against because, like, sure, I don't want to prolong the suffering of terminally ill patients who are in terrible pain. So it's like, on one hand, I do see the logic in allowing them to take some drug that knocks them to sleep and numbs them while they die. Like, I do see why people advocate that, and yet I feel reluctant to ever promote that idea, if that makes sense.
Well, but that doesn't that seem analogous to the antinatalist position? In other words, like the antinatalist position is that if you have a child, they're going to experience some pain, so it's better not to have a child. It's better for the child not experience life. So like, I mean, and like we're talking about euthanasia, fine. We're talking about, people who are maybe very old and very sick. But this antinatalist argument isn't necessarily restricted to the unborn. You could have the same antinatalist argument apply to a 5-year-old. You could say, well, the 5-year-old might be doing well, but but there's a chance that when they become an adult that, they're going to experience so much pain. So let us end the child's life for their benefit. I mean, do you see the similarity between the antinatalist argument and the argument for like, killing even like, people that are born, that it's the same argument?
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying. I completely understand that. And here's what I would have to say about that, George, is it is similar. The idea of killing somebody because that spares them future suffering, that really does make a whole lot of sense why somebody would support the killing of somebody, whether they were unborn, whether they were born, whether they were young or they were old, because they could always be sparing them some future suffering. So that could be used at any age.
Right. And so like, my reaction to that is like, well, doesn't that seem really wrong? I mean, like, it may seem right in the case of somebody with a terminal illness who's in a great deal of pain, but, apply to a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old who's like experiencing a relatively normal existence, to kind of like postulate or suggest that like ending their life is going to make their existence better, that to me, that's anathema. That's like, that's why we have laws against murder.
Yeah, and see, what's interesting is, I'm very uncomfortable with murder. I think killing is a bad thing, which is kind of ironic because here I just kind of gave this speech about all that's wrong and all the suffering.
It's only as a last resort.
Yeah, but see, it's interesting. Now, as you know, George, I think you know this. What I am promoting and what Monique is promoting is we have a way to not impose suffering on somebody, but also not murder them, and that is by not having sex. And so what's ironic about it, George, is that Now I'm speaking personally here. For me, the only way to be consistent with my view of not imposing suffering on someone, but also because I don't feel right about killing people, is to never procreate them in the first place. So my thing is that I am not comfortable with the idea of murdering somebody, but I'm completely okay with the idea of never bringing them here in the first place. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, it is, because like in both cases, there's the same results. It's denying, an organism either a life or a prospective life. Yeah, and again, that's based on the kind of premise that not existing is beneficial. It's superior. It's more beneficial than existing. In our physical form. And I mean, like, and actually, so Chandler, you kind of like remind me of an inconsistency in a sense in my position, because like I argue for the value of life, for not killing people, for having kids, because people enjoy that. But I also hold the belief that that once we die, we all go to a much better place, a bliss. So like by this argument that I hold, if I the extension of that argument would be that, well, like if we all go to a better place when we die, then actually you're doing somebody a favor by killing them. So,
yes, and that I'm so glad that you brought that up, George. You have no idea how glad I am that you brought that up, because I would tell you, if I believed that we went to a better place after we die, well then guess what? I would be in completely full support of killing somebody at any age. It doesn't matter, born, unborn, young or old. If they're going to go to a better place, a happy place full of bliss when they die, then I will never do anything to stop killing. I will always allow it based on that reasoning.
I think we're talking about the nuclear option. Just like, you set off a bunch of nuclear bombs, everybody's gone, everybody goes to this other place.
I know it sounds funny, but yeah, I completely agree. And see, now, George, it's important to point out that I became this like anti-killing dude. I wasn't this way as a Christian. I wasn't. This happened more after atheism, because I was like, oh, well, now I don't feel that killing is good because you're taking away the only life they get. But back when I was a Christian, I would have said, oh sure, if somebody kills somebody, well then they'll go to wherever they go. But then there was the whole hell thing, so you don't know whether they're going to heaven or hell, and that really complicates it. Because what we were just talking about a minute ago, George, is the idea that we all go to a place of bliss. But then Christians have this teaching that you could also go to a place of eternal torment, which really throws in, it mixes it up, doesn't it?
They stole from the Greeks.
Yep.
Yep. And you're right, Chandler. And like, we've been speculating based on the prospect that, that non-existence is more desirable than existing in this incarnation. But, the most basic reality is that we don't know. That's the most sincere statement. So basically, and that's what we have to. That's what we're up against. We're up against like making a decision to either bring a person into a known entity, or in case of like procreation, or resigning a person to an unknown entity. And, I guess most of us are more familiar or more comfortable with, well, like, for example, nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow, right? But if you ask anybody whether they want to, stick around to see tomorrow, I think most people would say, yeah, oh, yeah, because they have this experience, because life, is a known, it's painful and all, but it's more desirable, it's preferable to an existence that's completely unknown.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I do feel that, I feel that part of what would make me sad if I died was knowing that I wasn't going to get to see what happens next. There is something like okay, life is a movie. Okay, life really is a movie. We've talked about that. But life is a movie where it's never over. It's a never-ending story. No matter at what point you cut it short, then there's more of the story that you didn't get to see because you died. You know?
Yeah, and actually, it just got me on like thinking on, maybe segueing to this. Like, I think Chandler, we agree on this that there is a consciousness, or I'm not sure we agree on this. Like, in other words, like, if the universe in its totality, both pre-Big Bang and for eternity, is this being, this one all-encompassing being that we don't have to refer to as religiously as the Christian, Judeo-Christian God and all, but it's this being that has always existed, and that I guess knows everything, knows itself, whatever. I mean, like we got to do an episode on what it's like to be that kind of being, like, and again we could do it like just kind of speculating like whether it be the Judeo-Christian God or whether it's a more pantheistic version of this this unitary being, because I mean you hear some Poffo, some people say, like, for example, like, oh yeah, like no, being in bliss would be horrible because you'd get used to it and it ultimately become a curse and all.
Actually, it would be good at first. Then it'll get bored after a while.
Well, but WSD,
I think that's what he was saying.
Exactly, but what people like don't recognize, like, for example, if I bring up that prospect, let's say we could like develop a medicine, because I've come to the belief that all kinds of negative emotions that are prolonged, at least, are illness. They're just like they're we can consider them illness. So like we come up with a medicine that blisses everybody out, and so like my premise excludes any possibility of boredom, because like this medicine is designed to not just bliss a person out, but to prevent even the slightest bit of boredom.
Right.
So, like,
a true bliss would not even have that negative emotion of boredom. So I agree there. I disagree with Poffo on that idea that we get bored in bliss. But I actually have more to say, but I really need to use the restroom. So how about you and WSD talk for a few minutes until I come back?
Sounds good.
All right.
And about 15 minutes, I gotta head out. So.
All right, that sounds good.
Yeah, because
how's your New Year's?
Oh, it's cool. Everything's cool. I went down to the Mummers and all.
Yeah, we in White Plains.
Well, I had the Mummers. They call it the Mummers Parade down here in Philly. I don't know what they call it.
What is it? What are Mummers?
They're a bunch of parade. They put on a show every year.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Down at City Hall, and everything's blocked off.
Here in White Plains, we have we have a couple of blocks that are blocked off. They actually fenced them off this time. You had to go through a search to get in first year, but it draws the paper said 25,000 people, which that seems like a lot, but there were at least I would guess at least 5,000 that I could estimate. And it's fun. It's outside with one of those band stages and a rock band and whatever. It's pretty cool. So all right,
nice.
So what's your view relative to like natalism, procreation, all that stuff? Or do you hold Chandler's position that it's better that we don't procreate?
Yeah, I think I hold Chandler's position because, like I said, and from what I've seen, unless, like I said, I don't believe that you shouldn't have kids, but I just believe I wouldn't have kids. The reason why I say that is like, if you can't take care of the kid, don't bring him into this world. Because if you can't take care of him, and you can't take care of him, and your life sucks, you can barely take care of yourself. You're just bringing the kid into a bad situation.
Agreed. I'm back, guys.
Okay.
That's all you're doing. You're just bringing them into a bad position. Now, for example, like you said earlier, they have a family. they have a family, they had one kid, but they want to experience it again. Their family is secure, they're educated and all. The kid, then okay, I get condone you having a kid because kids gonna raise up in a positive environment. I don't want the kid to be raised up in a negative environment where there's a
Right.
lot of bad influences and all that. That's where I believe.
And I'm wondering what that's interesting because I'm wondering what the facts are about this. In other words, like there's a lot of people who were born into disadvantaged backgrounds. Their parents abused them or something, or just weren't good parents, and they went on to enjoy really good lives, relatively good lives. So I'm wondering what the percentage might be. What are the odds of a person, of a kid from that kind of a background, just being able to like evolve beyond it?
Well, if the parents suck at their job, the odds are pretty low.
That's
But
I'm
like I
wondering.
said, if the parents are pretty good at their job, like I said, you're not when it comes to parenting, there's no such thing as a perfect parent. I
Right.
understand that. But what I'm saying is, like I said, you're a bad person. You're a bad individual. You can't take any criticism. You can't. You're just not a bad individual. I mean, a good person. Excuse me. You shouldn't be having kids.
It's interesting,
And
though, is
here's another
like,
thing that kills. If you have one kid, you can barely take care of that one. You should learn from your mistake. Don't have another one. Don't have number one. Don't have number two or three, four, five, six, sometimes 16.
right.
Yeah.
I would like, Chandler. Maybe you're familiar with this statistic. Like the progeny of let's say abused, child abused kids, of the parents who actually abused them, not just were bad parents. How many of them go on to live happy lives? And the inverse, the opposite is, like, for example, what's the percentage of kids from very good parents who end up having horrible lives? Because I imagine that happens too.
Yeah, it can happen both ways. And that's part of it is that parents cannot guarantee that their child will have even the best intentioned parents can't make sure that their children don't have horrible suffering later on in their life. What can they possibly do about that? And
Yeah,
similarly, the positive news is that even if the parents are abusive, that, like you said, that child does have a chance as long as they live. Their situation may improve. They'll eventually be an adult. They may get out on their own. They may be able to make some happiness for themselves later on, so to speak. So you just don't
Yeah.
know.
And so, like, I mean, like, then do we base our decision on probabilities? In other words, like, if it's likely, if the probability of a child, coming from, let's say, an abusive childhood to become happy is, let's say, 50%. Is that good enough, or must it be 60%? What would be the actual probability that would justify that kind of situation?
Well,
Or, or
here's an interesting thought, George. For me personally, I would say it would have to be 100% certainty that they would have a good life. I would need that kind of certainty because without it, I can't do the decision.
Right. Oh, well, all right. So, like, but again, so, like, how about, like, and your
hmm?
I think the crux of your position is consent, right? You couldn't do this to a being without their consent. But let's consider ourselves. In other words, we have consent. We as adults, for example, we don't know. We know that this life of ours is going to have a certain amount of pleasure, a certain amount of pain, and hopefully, fortunately for most of us, it has substantially more pleasure than pain. But we don't know what tomorrow is going to hold and all, right? It's kind of like it's the same kind of unknown as bringing a child into the world. Um, isn't that the logic? Doesn't the logic behind your argument? I mean, in other words, what's so you're saying that because we have a consent, because it's up to us then we can decide to live and not, for example, commit suicide because we're making the decision. It is under consent. And actually, the other kind of like a wrench into this that we have to consider is like, you know, we think we have consent in whether we choose to continue living or not. But we, more than anyone else, knows that no, that's not up to us.
Right. I understand, and this is true, George, that we don't literally have a choice. You know this. We don't literally have a choice because what we choose is predetermined by the prior causes that made us want to choose that at that instance. So we get that free will is an illusion. So, of course, there is no literal consent, and yet I definitely feel like that we should generally not do things to people that they don't want. But here's the catch. We don't know what non-existent people would want or not want. Which I see. That is a little bit weird.
Right. But Chandler, I think we've kind of like come up with a way to challenge the consent point. In other words, like if the most fundamental understanding is that nobody has any consent over anything, how is consent relative to deciding whether to procreate or not?
Well, what's interesting is there's a lot more to it than just the consent. The consent thing is a part of it. It's still important, but it's not literal consent. But there's a lot more to it. See, here's the deal. Even if the non-existent child could consent and tell us that this is funny talking about non-existent children talking to us.
Some people believe that, yeah.
I know, but it sounds funny. But let's just, for the sake of this example, just go with me. I know it sounds weird. So let's say the non-existent child tells us that it wants to exist. There's another problem. Whatever that child will do in their life, their whole life, I'm talking about their whole life, they will end up doing other things to those people, including the non-human animals, that they did not consent to. So there's a problem there in that if a vegan could procreate and out could come a carnist later in life, so like, it's terrible. A vegan can't procreate, or they're a hypocrite. That's my problem there.
Yeah, and again, so like we're back to then the fundamental consideration of whether an existence, about which we, at least scientifically know nothing, is more desirable to an existence that we know quite well and we know isn't perfect. And actually, this reminds me of a saying that I've I think tried to adapt in my own life and in my view of the world. For years, for decades, I allowed myself, I think unwisely, to suffer the state of the world. In my mind, this could be a paradise. And because it's not, and I mean for everyone, and it should be a paradise for everyone. But because it's not, in my mind, I would kind of suffer it. And so there's this expression that says the perfect is the enemy of the good. In other words, wanting perfection and being dissatisfied and suffering when things aren't perfectly good is not really good, because things aren't perfect. So I'm wondering, I'm asking this more of a question, can this be applied to the position that non-existence is more desirable, or is preferable to this life that's not perfect, but that has a lot of good to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a very good talk, isn't it, guys?
Yep.
I mean, this topic gets very interesting, and I feel that this is the purpose of philosophy, is that we're talking ethically, in a sense here, about how good or bad procreation is. And there's several different layers to this. Because, okay, now this is going to sound really weird, but here's a hypothetical situation. Okay, now let's say that some horrible accident, of course, it may not be horrible if this accident happened, if everyone died and went to a place of bliss. But okay, let's just say that something kills off every human on the planet, okay, except for me and one woman somewhere. So then an interesting scenario happens. This woman wants to procreate, and I'm the only man left on the planet. So she seeks me out and tries to get me to procreate with her. If you get what I'm saying. Let's just say.
I'm sorry, humanity would still be screwed.
Yeah. Yes.
But I'm just saying, you need at least 300 individuals to keep the race going.
Right. So see, here's the deal. Here's what I'm saying. Let's say this happened, that there was only those two. There was only me and some woman. It could be any woman. Well, there will be no more human race at that point, because at that point, since I am, of course, we know this is never going to happen, guys. So it's just a funny thought experiment.
You never know.
Right. So here's the thing. Yeah, we don't know. Yeah. Okay. So here's the deal. In order for that woman to get me to agree to help her procreate, what does she have to do? She has to convince me and make me 100% certain that the child will experience no suffering, and when it dies will go to a place of bliss or something like that. And so she would have to convince me of that, which she couldn't. But there's another problem. There's more to it. Because I am against causing pain to people whenever possible, I will also not put that woman through a pregnancy, because women suffer during pregnancy. So even if she wants,
there's a possibility they can die.
Yes, they could also die. So I would be, by making that woman pregnant, I would be causing her pain and possibly killing her. So then what it really comes down to is I would not be willing to do that. So, but here's where it goes a step even further, and this is gonna sound really weird, but this gets funnier the longer I go. At least I hope so. So, but let's suppose that she did convince me that she would experience no suffering and would not die during the whole pregnancy, and that the child would forever have a perfect life of bliss. Supposing that she convinces me of all this, she's still not going to get me to have sex with her, because I'm a sex-repulsed asexual. So
there's a cure for that.
So there's a problem. It's still not going to happen, but of course it would. But here's the deal, guys. We already know that if it wasn't me, but it was instead another man who was sexual, then guess what? His sex drive would automatically make him procreate with her, and he would not even consider all of the ethical considerations, because I've begun to really question in my life, and Monique will find this interesting too, because we do the celibacy show. I seriously wonder if people with sexual desire are capable of this long thought out reasoning about ethics, or if their sexual desire just basically shuts that part of their brain off.
Good point.
Basically, they want sex, and so they don't think about it.
Incidentally, I think Monique and you are really on to what's going to happen in the future. I think whether it's 200 years or 1,000 years from now, I think the norm is that people are going to only have intercourse for the purpose of having kids, and the rest of sex will be just completely non-intercourse, because and that's a way to end abortion, because it'll just make sense. But all right, Chandler, I want to address again, going back to, you're saying you need 100% assurance that the kid is going to not experience pain, but do you or do any of us apply this to our own lives? Because, for example, if I applied that to my life today, I'm saying to myself, well, is tomorrow going to be 100% pleasant for me? And if it isn't, I guess I should end my life today? So how does applying that reasoning to our own lives, does that work, or why wouldn't it work?
Well, here's my response to that, George, is that perhaps the reason that doesn't work for us is because we're not able to just, push a button and end our own life painlessly. I feel like if everybody had an emergency cord or a panic button or something like that, where they could, when they are suffering, could just end their life instantly and painlessly, I think a lot of people would press that button. I think, honestly, a lot of people would.
This isn't even about actually being in suffering, because you're talking about a future prospect, philosophical prospect that, if the child is gonna, potentially suffer, if it's not gonna have a 100% blissful life, we shouldn't have them. So like, if tomorrow, not that we're in pain, we could be like completely blissed out today, as a matter of fact. But if, what assurance would we need that tomorrow is going to be 100% blissful? And like, and again, like, it's just, it seems like that argument, when you apply it to ourselves, would kind of like justify that if our life isn't 100% blissful, then our life is as harmful or
Yo,
wrong.
I'll have to talk to y'all later. All right.
All right, WC.
All right. Y'all stay safe. All right.
You too. Next week. So
short.
Okay. So Chandler, it's just, so the idea is like, there's certainly, I think, a level at which a human being, I believe, would be justified in saying, well, there's so much pain in this life that it justifies ending it. But I think the vast majority of people, very fortunately, are way, far, very distant from that point. So then it's like, again, this isn't, the question I'm asking is, isn't your requirement for 100% bliss kind of like an example of the perfect being the enemy of the good?
Well, I do see what you're saying, because we don't really apply that same standard to our own lives, which is interesting. And yet, I think what happens is that we're in our life. We are in our life, and we're here, and we have a desire to live. And so I think what happens is that, based on the fact that even though we do experience suffering, a lot of us, I will say, there are a good number of us that do have a measure of pleasure that is more than the pain, and I'm certainly at that place in my life right now. I can't say I always was, and I was very suicidal when I was younger. But it's interesting. I suppose it's interesting. I've thought about this, but yeah, because by continuing in my own life, which of course it's not as if I have a choice, even a figurative choice. I know there's no literal choice, but like really what it comes down to is I feel like I'm kind of stuck here in this life, making the best of it I can, and I do have happiness in my life. After all, I get to talk with you guys about whether or not we should procreate and all this stuff. It is fun. I do have happiness in my life, so that keeps me going. So I suppose what happens is, in our own life, we're talking about our own subjective experience of what we're experiencing, whereas when we talk theoretically about these potential people that exist only if we procreate, we're talking about an abstract entity that is not real. You know what I'm saying? So it's a difference, if you get what I'm saying.
Well, I yes and no. In other words, like the essential consideration is whether life is good or worthwhile or worth sustaining if it's not perfect. In other words, like if we can be satisfied with an imperfect life and really enjoy it, really feel that it's a gift, then why would we want to impose a much higher standard, the 100% standard, like what you were saying before, to a future life?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, can we personally come to grips with life being imperfect is what I think is a fundamental question here. Because, like you said, perfect can be the enemy of good sometimes.
Exactly. And I think that, that's actually the root behind a lot of philosophy. The idea that, yes, it's like the world is filled with problems. There's, and like we solve new problems. For example, like we solved the problem of energy. Like many years ago, like people didn't have heated homes and, excuse me, air conditioning and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, our solution to these problems create new problems and stuff. So basically, we're stuck in an existence that problems are, in a certain sense, inevitable, but the fortunate thing, what Buddha discovered and what I discovered in my happiness research and experimentation and all, and just thinking it through, is that being very happy, very, very happy, and having a perfect world are really not mutually, dependent. In other words, like the world, it's just as it's possible for, let's say, an individual to be very miserable in a world where, like, a very, very beautiful, wonderful, almost perfect world. It's possible for us to be very, very happy in a world that has so many problems. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have to address, because I think what happens is, like, to the extent that we understand this, that our happiness isn't connected to the relative state of perfection of the world, then we can become happier and happier. And my hope and understanding is that as we become happier, as we allow ourselves, or as we overcome our tendency to suffer over things not being perfect, and as we become happier, then the hope and the expectation is that we're much more suited to make the world better. Like, if, for example, if we're unhappy, we're like so consumed with our own needs that we're not looking, to improve the world around us, because we're like just so wrapped up in our own existence. But the happier we become, the more possible it is for us to look around us and see how we can help others, who genuinely need help.
Yeah, regardless, we need to work on our happiness and the happiness of others, which is what we want to do, regardless of whether we ever come to an agreement on this whole procreation thing. But what I would say is that maybe people need to be focusing on making everybody who's here happy, rather than just gambling, playing the lottery of life by procreating, if that makes sense. Make everybody happy here first, thereby creating a higher probability of newer children having happiness, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, but again, like what I mean, there's the possibility. Let's say we extinct the not just the human species. Let's say, extend this to all of life, at least on this planet Earth, whatever. Then the reality is that, like, well, pleasure is dependent on life. That, like, when there's no life, there's no pain, but there's no pleasure either.
Right.
I mean, like, so is that more desirable? Yeah.
Well, yeah, sometimes I think it would be. Like I've said before, if I could push the philosophical red button that wipes out all life in the universe all at once, I often feel like I would do that, because it would not impose any suffering on anyone, because there would be no survivors.
Yeah, and again, going, I would hope that that a pleasant, maybe even blissful existence, perhaps, isn't dependent on life, because again, at least with human beings, we've only been here 130,000 years. With life, it's about 4 billion years old, so there were like 10 billion years of the existence of the universe, at least, of course, where there wasn't any life. So, like, non-life is much more, common to our universe than life. So it seems. I imagine it'd be the same in other parts of the universe. So sometimes I have the same position, for example, with people who kind of like value life. I value life, but then a lot of people, to them, death is this horrible enemy that's like, we're always trying to avoid it and all that. I think that's unwise. I think it's mistaken, because like to hold that position is to kind of like value this infinitesimally, small sliver of reality, and then condemn, or to just like, dismiss, or just, basically, I don't know what the right word is, but just like to have a very negative position on what the vast, at least temporally, state of us is. This idea of non-life. When we die. So yeah, I think that's one of the problems with the human species. It's like we've been taught to sanctify and value life, but I think we haven't been taught enough to kind of like hold an optimistic, positive position toward death also.
Yeah, and what I would like to say is that, like, where philosophy comes in is it's where we try to reason things out when we don't really know, in a sense. Like how science is all about being empirical and knowing things and verifying things to be true with certainty. You know what I mean? Philosophy, on the other hand, is more like we're trying to fill in the gaps and figure out the ethical way to live, how to be happy. But we are guessing. You know what I mean? Like, what it comes down to is we are guessing. We're having a discussion, which I feel is actually very productive. I think this has been a very productive talk, because it's making us think. And I'm sure whoever listens to this will also hear a lot of ideas presented that they've never heard before. And hopefully it'll lead to better happiness by us discussing this.
Yeah, we definitely got to do some episodes on happiness, because again, like that, Aristotle said happiness is the only end in life. I mean, it's so true. It's everything we do is designed either for our happiness or the happiness of others. I mean, there's no exemption to that. And but even though that knowledge is out there, it's been out there since the time of the Greeks, at least. What our problem is as a civilization is we've been, unfortunately, basically non-productively conditioned to get stuck in the phase where we're pursuing things that we believe are going to lead to greater happiness. And what makes matters worse is that many, if not most, of these avenues to greater happiness that we pursue don't work. So we're not only stuck in like pursuing happiness instead of like just being happy, or in other words, like, for example, like education. A lot of people will like pursue advanced degrees thinking, well, yeah, if I've got a bachelor's, then a master's is going to make me happier. If I've got a master's, then a PhD is going to make me happier. And then like, being assigned to whatever. I mean, people like spend years and so much money pursuing these kinds of goals with the expectation they're going to be happier. And the unfortunate truth is no, a person without a high school degree is no less happy than a person with a high school degree, who's no less happy with a person with a bachelor's or master's or PhD or anything. And this applies not just to education, to a great extent it applies to money and a lot of achievements. Yeah. So yeah, this happiness thing is really, really important.
Oh yeah, definitely. I love discussing these things. We talked about it a lot, but I actually have to get going too. So we really do need to end this. So any final closing statements, George?
No, just that, like, this, we started out with this this talk about randomness, and I think, one of the things we're trying to do as a group, because there's probably about a dozen of us that, occasionally just take part in these discussions, podcasts. We're trying to cultivate a keener intellect. We're trying to hone our intellectual skills and our tools and all. And this topic of randomness is in my opinion, a place where some of us, just need work, just like, basically strengthening their logic. I think you and I kind of like seem to get this, but some others of us in the group really haven't thought this through completely enough. So I hope we'll return to this thing more and more as a way to as not just for the fact itself, but as a tool for sharpening, the logic of the group.
Yeah, I mean, I think people will actually become smarter, more logical by listening to this and hearing us present our cases where we tend to have disagreements. Like we present opposing things, like, well, I agree with this person. Well, oh, I will agree with this person too that said this thing. It makes a person think listening to this stuff. So I really hope our audience, whoever you people are who just listen to us, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.